Trump insults Barack Obama's intelligence. Obama's one response destroys him on live TV. Forget the policy debates. Ignore the rallies. Dismiss the indictments. The true and enduring drama of our political age boils down to one simple, humiliating metric: the intellectual hierarchy. And tonight, Donald Trump, in a move of stunning, suicidal hubris, attempted to challenge the reigning champion. The result was less a political skirmish and more a public, televised lobotomy of his own ego. The entire spectacle began, as it so often does, in a cavernous, poorly lit arena, where a sea of red hats cheered every syntactical detour and rhetorical dead end. Trump, standing at the lectern, framed by an excess of American flags, was in mid-flight on one of his characteristic tangents, the kind of narrative that requires a willingness to suspend all belief in verifiable facts. But he crossed an invisible line. He swiveled his gaze, pointed with the characteristic aggressive gesture, and dared to target the one man whose academic and professional credentials stand as an ineluctable monument to intelligence: Barack Obama. The exact words, captured forever in the digital amber of cable news archives, were a predictable assault on a perceived enemy's mind. Obama was branded, dismissed, and relegated to the status of a simplistic adversary. The crowd, naturally, roared its approval, validating the notion that the man who believes wind turbines cause cancer is somehow the superior intellect to a former constitutional law professor. It was the purest distillation of the modern political paradox, the assertion of ignorance as a form of populist genius. But Barack Obama, who has spent years in the high-altitude atmosphere of strategic restraint, was not present at this rally. He was at a different gathering entirely, a quiet, erudite affair where paragraphs still matter and the concept of an actual book is not a foreign policy objective. When the inevitable question arrived, presenting Trump's intellectual slight, the atmosphere in the room changed. Obama didn't react with rage or offense. Instead, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face, the kind of expression that suggests a man has been handed the perfect, unanswerable opportunity. What followed was not a counter-argument. It was a rhetorical atom bomb wrapped in velvet. It was an intellectual guillotine, swung not with brute force, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a seasoned surgeon. The response, delivered with impeccable comedic timing and the casual air of swatting away an annoying gnat, was so lethal that it didn't just silence the argument, it annihilated the very premise of the challenger's authority. This was more than a political clapback. It was a public education on the difference between being merely loud and being genuinely smart. And for Trump, the humiliation was absolute, leaving his fragile sense of superiority visibly shaken, like a poorly constructed building after a controlled blast. We are about to dissect this flawless takedown, analyzing the precision of Obama's word choice, the strategic use of humility to deliver maximum damage, and contrasting it with the decades of intellectual gaffes that made Trump's initial challenge so monumentally ridiculous. Prepare for the full autopsy of an ego felled by a single, perfectly aimed sentence. The context is crucial because it highlights the sheer gravitational pull of Trump's ego. He was at a rally, bathed in those aggressively bright lights that seem to amplify every imperfection. Performing his usual routine of grievance and self-aggrandizement, he was not talking about the trade deficit or the judicial branch. He was engaging in the lowest form of political theater, personal, unsubstantiated character assassination. He chose the subject of intelligence, the most defensible territory for Obama, and the most treacherous for himself. The man who habitually mispronounces basic geographical names and confuses historical timelines dared to declare the constitutional law professor not a smart guy. Folks, not smart. I've spoken to people, very smart people, tremendous people, and they all say, he's not that bright. Believe me, the crowd, a collective echo chamber of confirmation bias, cheered the dismissal of academic rigor and intellectual discipline. They were celebrating the idea that one's gut feeling and perceived street smarts somehow supersede a magna cum laude degree and a decade of university-level teaching. It was the public elevation of ignorance to a political virtue. This attack was calculated to delegitimize Obama's entire legacy by suggesting that his accomplishments were either accidental or guided by unseen, smarter forces. The irony, of course, is that the man launching this charge inherited millions. ran multiple businesses into bankruptcy, including casinos, a feat of reverse alchemy, turning guaranteed profit into guaranteed loss, and secured his fame primarily through the selective editing of a reality television show. His intellectual portfolio is a collection of demonstrable failures and borrowed narratives. Enter Obama, far removed from the circus atmosphere, positioned instead in the quiet, focused environment of an intellectual forum. When the clip of Trump's claim was presented, the initial silence in the room acted as a drumroll to the devastating performance. Obama's trademark smile appeared, a slight upturn of the lips that communicates amusement mixed with deep, weary knowledge. This was not a man preparing to defend his honor, this was a man about to demonstrate conclusively that no defense was necessary. He didn't engage with the specific absurdity of the claim, he dismissed the claim's source. He delivered the first surgical strike. You know, I'd respond to that, but I try not to punch down. The power of punch down is phenomenal. It immediately established an unbreachable hierarchy. Obama didn't stoop, he simply acknowledged the chasm. He didn't call Trump a fool, he called him an inferior opponent. It was an insult delivered with the grace of a retreat, a statement that the competition was so mismatched it would violate the rules of dignified engagement. The audience reaction, that sudden, explosive burst of appreciative laughter, was the immediate recognition that the battle was over. The moral high ground was claimed, and the intellectual floor was ceded to Trump, definitively labeling his arena as the basement. Yet, the professor, recognizing that an educational opportunity should never be wasted, continued his lesson, turning the slight into a profound commentary on Trump's character. The follow-up went for the kill, targeting the well-known and often mocked intellectual habits of the challenger. Besides, I'm too busy reading. You remember reading, right? Those things with pages, not pictures, actual words. This was the rhetorical equivalent of explaining a complicated concept to a child. The deliberate simplification, the distinction between pages and pictures, between actual words and visual aids, was a direct, painful reference to the widely documented methods used to brief Trump during his presidency: short, bulleted memos, reliance on charts, and frequent repetition of his own name to ensure attention. Obama effectively reduced Trump's intellectual process to the level of a picture book, simultaneously affirming his own status as a serious scholar who engages with complex, actual words. The collective knowledge that Trump genuinely does not read, confirmed by countless former aides and his own public statements, made this line land with crushing, absolute veracity. It was not a political smear, it was a factual observation weaponized into an insult of devastating proportions. And then came the final stroke, the one that linked Trump's intellectual deficiency directly to his disconnection from the practical reality of governance. I could engage with someone who thinks you need a photo ID to buy cereal. But I feel like that's a conversation that requires, a baseline understanding of how grocery stores work. And reality. Reality is pretty important, too. This brilliant move utilized Trump's own easily verifiable, mundane ignorance, the bizarre and incorrect claim that citizens must show ID to purchase basic groceries, to invalidate his entire philosophical framework. Obama's point was not about voter ID, it was about the profound disconnect from common American life and the simplest shared facts of existence. How can one debate complex trade agreements or judicial appointments with a man who fundamentally misunderstands how a grocery store works? The implication is that Trump operates in such a rarefied, entitled sphere that he has lost touch with the very reality he purports to govern. The final, quiet assertion, reality is pretty important, too, was the ultimate checkmate. It reminded the world that competence is not optional, that facts are not feelings, and that the inability to grasp basic reality renders all claims of genius irrelevant. Obama's entire response, delivered without heat, anger, or loss of composure, was a single, perfect expression of intellectual superiority. He didn't just win the argument, he annihilated the premise of the challenge, leaving Trump to deal with the public humiliation of being exposed as the incurious simpleton he had tried to project onto his opponent. The immediate fallout from Obama's surgical 1-2 punch was a worldwide acknowledgement of the colossal intellectual mismatch. The response transcended political loyalties, it became a global reference point for competence versus delusion. The phrase, punch down, triggered an avalanche, not just of memes and animated GIFs, but of verifiable, indisputable facts intended to highlight the grotesque irony of Trump questioning anyone's intelligence. This was the moment the academic resume went to war with the reality TV pitch, and the former won a decisive victory on the first ballot without a single vote needing to be recounted. The entire nation, and indeed the informed world, performed a collective Google search on the credentials of the two men, and the results were a merciless public indictment of Trump's audacious claim. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was a brutal, objective comparison between deep, documented scholarship and self-proclaimed, baseless genius. Let's be brutally honest about the intellectual ledger of these two men, which is precisely what the press and the public immediately began to do. On one side, we have Barack Obama, an actual, credentialed scholar. His path was paved not with inherited privilege but with rigorous intellectual discipline. He attended Columbia University, followed by the formidable intellectual gauntlet of Harvard Law School, where he served as the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review, a position earned not through political favor, inherited wealth, or the ability to shout the loudest, but through pure, demonstrable merit, superior logic, and writing ability that remains a benchmark for legal scholarship. Following his academic achievements, he spent over a decade teaching constitutional law at the prestigious University of Chicago, widely considered one of the most demanding intellectual environments in the nation. This is a man who wrote his own best-selling books, plural, complex explorations of race, policy, and personal history that required sustained, coherent thought, sophisticated vocabulary, and a genuine understanding of the human condition. He doesn't just read intelligence briefings, he could likely write them. Or at the very least, critique their legal and constitutional basis with professorial precision. He possesses a cognitive complexity that allows him to hold multiple, contradictory ideas in his head and synthesize them into a coherent strategy, a hallmark of genuine intelligence. On the opposing side, we have Donald Trump. The official academic record remains shrouded in a secrecy typically reserved for military classified documents. Or perhaps the blueprints for the Ark. He attended Fordham, transferred to the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and refuses, to this day, to release any grades or transcripts. The only verifiable academic evidence comes from reports that he or his legal team have actively threatened his former educational institutions with legal action should they dare to disclose his performance. Innocent people, secure in their very high IQ, do not typically operate with such fear of disclosure. They wave their transcripts like flags. His intellectual achievements are primarily transactional, negotiating deals, branding skyscrapers, and, most tellingly, establishing an entity called Trump University, an unaccredited, self-serving enterprise that resulted in a successful, multi-million-dollar fraud lawsuit filed by former students. The only academic rigor involved in that institution was the rigor with which it defrauded its pupils. His greatest intellectual contribution to the public sphere has been his mastery of the rhetorical loop. The repetitive use of simple adjectives, very, tremendous, bigly, and the construction of sentences that begin nowhere and conclude in the void. He speaks in fragments and slogans, a verbal style that prioritizes emotional impact and affirmation over the actual conveyance of complex information. The contrast isn't a simple difference in pedigree, it's a profound divergence in cognitive function. The public outcry following Obama's dignified destruction immediately recalled Trump's most glaring intellectual errors, showcasing the stunning lack of self-awareness that preceded his attack. It's a catalog of moments where reality, science, and history were summarily dismissed in favor of gut feeling, personal anecdote, or outright fabrication. There was the infamous Revolutionary War quote, where he seemingly implied that airports were a key strategic asset in the conflict of 1776. Our army manned the air. It rammed the ramparts. It took over the airports. This wasn't just a misstatement, it was a chronological and technological impossibility, suggesting a fundamental ignorance of basic American history in the timeline of human invention. A person with genuine intelligence would simply admit the slip. Trump doubled down, suggesting that somehow, the history books were wrong, or that he possessed secret knowledge of 18th century aviation. Yet, This is the mind that deemed Obama not smart. Then there's the science. The bizarre conviction that windmills cause cancer, a claim that defies every law of physics, medicine, and common sense. The insistence that human energy is finite, like a battery, and that exercise should be avoided lest one deplete one's limited life force, a theory that would make a first-year biology student weep with despair and which conveniently excuses his own sedentary lifestyle. And, of course, the peak of his public health genius during the global pandemic, musing aloud to the nation's top medical experts about the potential benefits of injecting disinfectant or utilizing powerful light internally as a therapeutic solution. Dr. Deborah Birx's face in that press briefing, a mask of professional restraint fighting a losing battle with existential dread, will forever be the iconic visual representation of the intelligence gap. The scientist watching helplessly as the non-scientist proposes chemical self-poisoning as a treatment protocol. This is the man who dared to start a public debate on intellectual capability. The irony is not just thick, it is dense, toxic, and suffocating, requiring a hazmat suit just to analyze. The real, functional difference between the two men is not simply what they know, but how they communicate it. Obama's discourse, even on the most complex subjects, is structured, linear, and evidence-based. His sentences connect, his paragraphs build arguments, and he employs a vocabulary that challenges the listener. His communication style assumes an intelligent, engaged audience capable of handling nuance and complexity. He could explain the finer points of quantitative easing or constitutional jurisprudence without ever once resorting to very or tremendous. Trump's communication, conversely, is a study in circularity and projection. His rallies are not speeches, they are conversational streams of consciousness, dictated primarily by the energy of the crowd and whatever stray thought crosses his mind. They lack logical structure, pivot constantly, and rely on repetition rather than evidence. Linguists who have analyzed his speech patterns often conclude he operates at a linguistic complexity level far below that of a mature adult. A style characterized by simple, repetitive phrases that are high on emotion and low on information. He uses the word very as an intensifier for nearly every adjective, betraying a limited semantic range. His best words, as he claimed, are very limited. Obama's response, "I try not to punch down," was not just a witty retort, it was a profound, professional assessment of this difference in discourse. It was the law professor refusing to grade the crayon drawing of the child. It was the grandmaster declining to play checkers. It was an intellectual withdrawal that inflicted maximum, lasting damage, demonstrating that dignity and precision are far more potent weapons than volume and vitriol. The man who claims to have the best brain was just casually dismissed as intellectually beneath the notice of the man he was attacking. This distinction, the scholar versus the simpleton, was cemented forever in that singular, glorious moment of televised humiliation. The subsequent frantic, all-caps defense launched from Mar-a-Lago only served to confirm the devastating accuracy of Obama's assessment, proving that the only thing Trump fears more than losing an election is being exposed as not, in fact, the smartest person in any given room. The public, by contrast, had all the verifiable proof it needed. The immediate aftershocks of Obama's rhetorical strike were predictable for one man and dignified for the other. For Barack Obama, the moment passed quickly, integrated smoothly into a narrative of cool competence. He moved on to his planned activities, presumably involving the actual reading of actual words, secure in the knowledge that the debate was closed by his single, precise sentence. For Donald Trump, however, the wound was not a mere political scratch, it was deep and existential. The phrase, "punch down," became a dagger plunged directly into the heart of his greatest, most fragile insecurity, the public perception of his intelligence. Trump's response was not a measured counter-argument, nor was it a strategic pivot, it was a spectacular, televised unraveling of an ego under siege. The counterattack was launched, predictably, on his preferred digital platform, a barrage of all-caps missives, random punctuation, misspellings, and frantic assertions of mental superiority. The language was desperate, the tone wounded, and the core message a pitiful, public plea for validation. I am smarter than Obama. My IQ is higher. Everybody knows it. Release the transcripts. Very high score. tremendous genius. The former leader of the free world was, in real time, attempting to settle an academic debate using the rhetorical tools of a preteen who just lost an argument on the playground. He demanded that Obama release his college transcripts, a richly ironic and deeply familiar demand coming from the man whose own academic records remain locked away under threat of lawsuit. It is the ultimate act of projection, the man refusing to show his own grades demanding that the Harvard Law Review editor show his. This level of self-contradiction, this brazen hypocrisy, is precisely what makes his entire defense an amplification of Obama's initial insult. He is the pot, covered in grime and documented legal threats, demanding that the kettle produce an immaculate dental record, the relentless need to tell people he is smart, to insist on it, demand recognition for it, and defend it with venom, is the clearest possible evidence of the deep-seated, abiding fear that he is not. Genuine intelligence is self-evident, it manifests in output, in coherent argument, and in the capacity for nuance. Trump's frantic defense only confirmed Obama's premise. He was indeed punching down at someone deeply insecure and demonstrably beneath his intellectual weight class. The spectacle was not one of political sparring but of a child throwing a tantrum because his intellectual inadequacy had been pointed out on live television. The reason Obama's reading comment was so devastating is that it touched upon the established truth of Trump's intellectual method, a preference for simple, immediate validation over laborious knowledge acquisition. His relationship with knowledge is entirely transactional. Information is not sought for understanding, but for leverage or self-confirmation. If it doesn't directly benefit him or confirm his existing biases, it is dismissed, often with contempt, as fake news or the rambling of elites. This willful incuriosity is the antithesis of the scholarly mind. We are talking about a man whose closest aides, now chroniclers of his dysfunction in best-selling books that serve as a kind of presidential pathology library, confirmed that briefing documents had to be simplified, reduced to bullet points, and included his name repeatedly just to maintain his attention. This is the intellectual diet of someone whose focus is fleeting, whose patience for complexity is non-existent. Meanwhile, Obama's post-presidency has included publicly released reading lists featuring everything from literary fiction to complex philosophical texts and global history. His annual book recommendations are scrutinized because he actually reads them, can articulate their themes, critique their structure, and discuss their relevance to the modern world. It is the contrast between a mind actively seeking to expand its understanding of the world and a mind defensively closed off. Content in its own limited, self-referential bubble. For Trump, intellectual effort is viewed as a zero-sum game, a finite resource that should be conserved. For Obama, it is a renewable source of power and understanding. Further underscoring the intellectual hypocrisy is the subject of authorship. Obama's literary credentials are secure, his books are complex, entirely his own work, and stand as serious contributions to political thought and memoir. Trump's supposed literary achievement, The Art of the Deal, required a ghostwriter, Tony Schwartz, who has since publicly and repeatedly expressed profound regret for helping to craft the myth of the genius businessman that the book purported to define. The man who claims intellectual superiority didn't even write his own seminal text, he merely provided the narrative framework and, crucially, his name, another piece of his branding, not his brainpower. This difference is key. Obama's intellectual output is genuine creation, Trump's is branding and delegation. One is a scholar who teaches, the other is a salesman who labels. The public exchange became a referendum on these two forms of achievement, the deep, verifiable substance of the academic, versus the shiny, superficial branding of the promoter. Obama, in his 2 short sentences, reminded the world that while branding can make you famous, it doesn't make you smart. And the emperor of ego, when challenged on intellectual grounds, has no clothes. The final, humiliating irony in the meltdown phase was Trump's insistence that Obama's elegant reply must have been scripted, written by a teleprompter, or provided by an aide. This projection is the ultimate, desperate defense mechanism, because Trump himself is incapable of such spontaneous, nuanced wit. He cannot accept that his opponent is. He fundamentally misunderstands the difference between a rehearsed line and genuine, situational brilliance, the difference between a prepared statement and true, agile intelligence. For Trump, Complex thought must be sourced externally. He cannot conceive that it flows naturally from a superior mind. He believes everything is transactional and therefore assumes that Obama's words were purchased, not produced. This inability to credit Obama's spontaneous brilliance only served as the final, pitiful confirmation of his own intellectual limits, highlighting a mind that struggles to understand the very concept of innate, cultivated talent. The ego, hemorrhaging from the punch-down wound, was completely unraveling, creating a public spectacle that was both humiliating and endlessly illuminating. A clear signal that the president who claimed to have the best brain was, in fact, the most intellectually fragile. The chaos of this aftermath extended beyond just the tweets and the self-aggrandizing claims. It involved the spectacle of his surrogates attempting, futilely, to spin the event. They deployed predictable defenses, claiming Obama was elitist or condescending, which, coming from the defenders of a literal billionaire who lives in a golden tower and refuses to interact with the common public, was a staggering exercise in semantic gymnastics. The irony was lost on them, but not on the rest of the world. They attempted to deflect, reviving the decade-old, debunked birther conspiracy, a dark, racist attempt to undermine Obama's legitimacy that Trump had championed for years. By reaching for the same discredited conspiracy theory, they only proved Obama's point. When faced with intellectual defeat, they retreat to the comfort of unreality and prejudice. The meltdown, therefore, was a total systemic failure of ego, failure of defense, and a catastrophic failure of intellectual honesty. The professor had not just insulted the promoter, he had exposed the entire mechanism of the sham. The brilliance of Obama's response lies not just in its content, the direct and justified attack on Trump's intellectual habits, but in its delivery and framing. It was a masterclass in the weaponization of wit, demonstrating that the most effective political counterpunch is often one delivered with grace, impeccable timing, and a ruthless economy of language. This was not a verbal spat, it was a highly disciplined rhetorical maneuver. A calculated demonstration of the strategic value of intellectual superiority. The power of the phrase, "I try not to punch down," is its deadly dual functionality. Firstly, it immediately employed the language of moral high ground, positioning Obama as the mature, restrained figure who chooses dignity over confrontation. This is a subtle but critical political move. It validates the enduring image of Obama as the sophisticated adult in the room, contrasting sharply with the juvenile rhetoric that has defined Trump's public persona. It suggests that while Trump seeks to drag political discourse into the gutter, Obama consciously resists the descent, thereby elevating himself simply by virtue of his refusal to engage on low terms. Secondly, and far more lethally, it delivered a direct, unvarnished insult using polite, almost humanitarian terms. By defining Trump's status as down, Obama effectively stated, without using a single vulgar or insulting word, that his opponent is his intellectual inferior. He made the judgment sound objective, not personal, a simple acknowledgement of a fact, like observing the law of gravity. He wasn't saying, "You are stupid," he was saying, "The intellectual difference between us is so vast that engaging with you would be unfair. A violation of sporting conduct." This framing immediately transformed Trump's aggressive accusation into pathetic whining. The challenger was suddenly defined as the underdog in a fight he initiated. And the punch was pulled not out of fear, but out of calculated, condescending mercy. It's the ultimate expression of sophisticated disdain, an insult wrapped in the pretense of ethical restraint. The choice of words is reflective of a mind capable of complex, layered thought. It's the difference between a blunt, shouted insult and a finely crafted, satirical remark that requires a moment of cognitive processing to fully appreciate its sting. Trump's insults operate at the immediate, visceral, emotional level, e.g., loser, low IQ, fat. Obama's operates at the cognitive level, forcing the listener, and crucially, the target, to recognize the inherent, undeniable hierarchy being established. The second part of the response, the reading comment, elevated the exchange from a mere political jab to a comedic, cultural touchstone, etching the moment permanently into the public consciousness. Besides, "I'm too busy reading." You remember reading, right? Those things with pages, not pictures. Actual words. The pause before the follow-up. The slight tilt of the head. The gentle, almost professorial tone. All these elements were employed to maximize the rhetorical damage. Comedic timing is critical to political rhetoric. And Obama's was flawless. He let the first line land, generating the initial burst of laughter and applause that certified the initial verdict. And then, before the energy could dissipate, he delivered the specific, deeply personalized blow. The phrase, "not pictures, actual words," acts as a specific, highly publicized indictment of Trump's rumored need for simplified, picture-laden briefing documents. It transforms Trump from a formidable political rival into an adult struggling with literacy. A figure whose complexity barrier is literally overcome with visual aids. The beauty is that this barb is anchored in reality. It is based on leaks, reports, and the published accounts of former White House staff. It is an insult grounded in verifiable truth, which makes it infinitely more damaging than any invented slur. Trump could dismiss being called a loser, but he could not so easily dismiss the factual observation that he avoids intellectual rigor. The response was effective because it wasn't just funny or mean, it was demonstrably, tragically true. The contrast in communication skills on display here is staggering. Trump's political speech is characterized by its sloppiness, its aggressive informality, and its lack of structural discipline. It's a scattergun approach, relying on repetition, emotional manipulation, and simple slogans rather than logical argument. His verbal tics, the constant qualifiers, the sentences that simply dissolve into the ether, the inability to adhere to a script, are all signs of a mind that struggles with structure and complexity. His discourse resembles a meandering, chaotic monologue. It is the verbal equivalent of a labyrinth designed with no exit. Obama, by contrast, demonstrated the power of rhetoric deployed by a highly educated, disciplined mind. His response was a single paragraph that achieved more structural and substantive impact than Trump's 2-hour rally rant. It was coherent, witty, and devastatingly efficient. It was the rhetorical equivalent of a controlled demolition, precise charges placed at the foundation, resulting in a clean, immediate collapse, rather than the wild, messy swinging of a wrecking ball. He used language as a scalpel, whereas Trump uses it as a club. In the history of political exchanges, this moment will be studied as a perfect example of how to handle an intellectually inferior opponent. Obama didn't lower himself to the level of the fight, he drew his opponent up, only to immediately dismiss him for failing to meet the basic standards of the elevated conversation. The weapon was wit, the ammunition was fact, and the target's ego was instantly and publicly shredded. The performance was a timely, unforgettable reminder that the presidential office, at its best, demands not just power, but a deep, functional intelligence that can be spontaneously deployed with devastating effect. The exchange confirmed that Obama is secure enough in his own intellectual capacity to use restraint as a weapon, while Trump is so fragile that he must constantly assert his intelligence, a trait that always betrays the opposite. The difference is the chasm between the self-made scholar and the self-proclaimed genius. Beyond the mere exchange of witty insults, the intellectual mismatch between the two men has had profound, tangible consequences on policy, governance, and the nation's standing in the world. The underlying tragedy of Trump's insistence on his own superior intelligence is that this delusion directly led to impulsive, ill-informed policy decisions and moments of national embarrassment that cannot be dismissed as simple rhetorical gaffes. Obama's subtle reference to Trump's lack of a baseline understanding of how grocery stores work was not just a joke, it was a perfect, devastating segue into the fundamental incoherence of his approach to governance, demonstrating that a deficit of basic curiosity translates into dangerous governmental incompetence. The most damning aspect of Trump's intellectual style is its direct translation into national policy. His major policy shifts often seemed less like strategic, long-term decisions developed through careful study, and more like impulsive reactions based on the last friendly voice he heard, a segment on cable news, or a headline that flattered his ego. The infamous clean coal concept is a perfect illustration of this intellectual carelessness. Trump, captivated by the simple, powerful phrase, often seemed to imply that coal could be literally washed to remove its environmental pollutants, mistaking a complex, expensive engineering concept, carbon capture and storage technology, for a rudimentary household chore. This simple confusion demonstrated a profound inability to engage with the actual science and engineering required, leading to policy promises that were fundamentally disconnected from environmental and economic reality. He confused the branding with the product, the slogan with the strategy. Similarly, his approach to global trade was characterized by a simplified, zero-sum worldview, often confusing basic trade deficits with national financial losses, as if the entire, massive global economy were merely a series of individual transactions at a local market, where if your neighbor buys less from you than you buy from him, you are being ripped off. His policy on tariffs was an impulsive imposition based on a superficial understanding of international economics and historical trade relationships, which often required his own cabinet secretaries and trade representatives to work frantically behind the scenes to contain the unpredictable damage of his off-the-cuff pronouncements. The man who claims the best brain struggled publicly and repeatedly with the most rudimentary concepts of macroeconomic policy, viewing multi-layered global finance through the narrow, simplified lens of a 1980s real estate developer. The intellectual gap became a matter of national security and international stability during Trump's tenure, while Obama could fluidly discuss the nuances of global supply chains, geopolitical strategy, and historical conflict without notes, demonstrating an easy command of complex, disparate facts. Trump repeatedly stumbled over basic facts, geography, and diplomatic protocol. His handling of the situation with Turkey, his chaotic withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, an agreement based on decades of accumulated global scientific data, and his transactional, personality-driven relationships with authoritarian leaders all spoke to a policy style driven by personal intuition and ego, rather than sober, informed strategic planning. The constant need to be flattered and agreed with by foreign leaders led to diplomatic gaffes that undermined U.S. credibility. Recall the UN General Assembly incident, where he was greeted with outright laughter after making grand, exaggerated claims about his own administration's achievements. His subsequent insistence that the world leaders were laughing with him, not at him, was a painful public display of the ego's inability to process negative feedback or recognize humiliation, a fatal flaw in high-stakes diplomacy. His approach to alliances was equally simplified. If a country didn't immediately acquiesce to his demands or flatter him personally, the alliance was deemed unfair or exploitative. This is not strategic thought, it is the emotional reaction of a petty child, applied to the most sensitive diplomatic relationships, risking decades of carefully constructed global stability. The contrast with Obama's measured, multilateral approach, requiring detailed knowledge of history, international law, and cultural context, could not be starker. A person's intelligence and self-security can be judged by the people they choose to surround themselves with. This metric provides perhaps the most devastating evidence against Trump and in favor of Obama's indictment. Obama's cabinet and senior staff were overwhelmingly composed of credentialed experts, scholars, decorated military officials, seasoned diplomats, and individuals with decades of specialization in their respective fields. His administration was designed to maximize expertise, encourage intellectual debate, and demand evidence-based conclusions. Trump's administration, conversely, became a revolving door of unqualified loyalists, personal friends, and individuals whose primary qualification seemed to be the willingness to offer public, effusive praise. His appointments often demonstrated a profound disregard for relevant expertise. Ben Carson, a renowned neurosurgeon, was placed at the head of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. Betsy DeVos, a strong advocate with no public school experience or deep understanding of basic educational pedagogy, was appointed Secretary of Education. This systemic disregard for subject matter expertise is a defining characteristic of an insecure intellect. If the leader believes he knows more than the experts about medicine, climate, or economics, he only needs to hire people who will confirm his pre-existing, poorly informed notions. The result of this intellectual carelessness was profound governmental chaos, an unprecedented number of resignations, firings, indictments, and tell-all books penned by former staffers detailing the deep dysfunction and wholesale disregard for established procedure. Obama's administration, while facing intense policy debates, enjoyed a basic level of internal stability and legal adherence. Trump's was defined by legal and political turmoil, a direct result of valuing fealty over competence. Obama's response, therefore, was not merely about personal insults, it was an efficient, public distillation of the real-world costs of allowing arrogance and intellectual sloth to occupy the highest office. The man who couldn't understand how a grocery store works was tasked with running the most complex government on earth, and the predictable consequence was 4 years of sustained, self-inflicted chaos and demonstrable policy failure. The intellectual skirmish launched by Trump and decisively ended by Obama highlights the fundamental difference in the desired legacies of the two presidents. Obama is focused on a legacy of substance, policy, and enduring constitutional adherence. His ambition is to be a figure studied for his solutions and his intellectual approach to complex problems. Trump, conversely, is obsessed with a legacy of brand, perceived power, and personal celebrity. His ambition is to be remembered simply for what he claimed to be: the biggest, the best, the smartest. This is the difference between a man who seeks to be remembered for what he did and a man who wants to be remembered for what he asserted. Obama's legacy is already secured in the annals of political science. His speeches are studied in communication departments globally, analyzed for their rhetorical structure, emotional weight, and historical resonance. His capacity to weave together historical reference, policy detail, and aspirational rhetoric is widely considered the gold standard of modern American political communication. Historians and political scholars will debate his policies for generations, the effectiveness of the stimulus, the wisdom of the Affordable Care Act, the strategic patience in foreign policy, but they will never debate the sheer intelligence and sophistication he brought to the office. He created a legacy based on the enduring word and verifiable intellectual output. His presidency restored a level of intellectual engagement with the executive branch that had been absent, treating policy as a problem set to be solved by experts, not a reality show plotline to be spun. His response to Trump, the punch down and the actual words line, is destined to be a permanent fixture in this historical record. It is a moment of perfect political wisdom and comedic precision that will be used in future university seminars as a definitive example of how a leader maintains dignity while utterly annihilating a critic. The longevity of this moment is guaranteed precisely because it required genuine wit and intelligence to execute. It will be quoted, analyzed, and celebrated long after Trump's latest all-caps rant about windmills and toilets has disappeared into the ephemeral digital dust. The moment is a testament to the power of intellectual restraint over unbridled ego. Trump's legacy, conversely, is defined by its impermanence and its reliance on sheer volume and repetition. His rallies and pronouncements are ephemeral, fading immediately after they are delivered because they lack structure and genuine depth. His vocabulary is repetitive, his arguments shallow, and his focus entirely on immediate, transactional victory, or, more accurately, the appearance of victory. His communication style, as previously noted, is one of constant self-reference, which suggests a mind that is perpetually focused inward, unable to transcend its own need for affirmation. The historical record will not remember his complex policy achievements, for they are few and often undermined by self-sabotage, but rather the sheer noise he generated, the lawsuits, the impeachments, the bizarre gaffes, and the endless stream of unsubstantiated claims. His legacy is the brand of bluster. The stark contrast between their methods of communication ensures the longevity of Obama's retort. When asked a complex question, Obama could pause, acknowledge the complexity, synthesize information from various sources, history, economics, legal precedent, and deliver a nuanced, multifaceted answer that treated the public as an intelligent audience. Trump, when asked a complex question, typically blames someone else, claims he knows more than the experts, or resorts to simple, often false, generalizations, all delivered with an air of absolute, unearned certainty. He cannot tolerate the intellectual humility of admitting uncertainty or the difficulty of a problem. For him, doubt is weakness, and therefore, all answers must be immediate and simple, even if they are demonstrably wrong. This intellectual hubris directly fueled the initial attack on Obama. Trump's inability to comprehend a mind that functions on a higher level leads him to conclude that such sophisticated behavior must be a fraud, that the eloquence is fake. The complexity is a trick, and the education is meaningless. He projects his own methods onto Obama, assuming the brilliant comeback was scripted because his own brain is incapable of generating such spontaneous, layered wit. He cannot grasp that the constitutional law professor's mind is trained to synthesize, analyze, and deploy language with instantaneous rhetorical precision. Furthermore, the longevity of Obama's response is guaranteed because it exposed the fundamental childishness of Trump's ego. The entire political drama surrounding Trump is fueled by his inability to tolerate being exposed as anything less than the best. When Obama casually dismissed him as beneath the fight, as someone who needed basic facts explained to him, it was a public emasculation that Trump could never truly recover from. He can rage tweet and claim conspiracy, but the public record, in that single video clip, provides the unassailable truth. One man is intellectually secure enough to use restraint as a weapon. The other is so fragile he collapses under the slightest intellectual pressure. Future generations of political scientists, communicators, and historians will watch this clip and understand it as a perfect microcosm of the era, the triumph of substance over spectacle. The clarity of the scholar over the noise of the showman. Trump's words will be forgotten quickly. Obama's will be studied for their craft. That is the indelible mark of true intelligence. It creates something lasting and insightful. The insult Trump launched will be merely a footnote, lost in the chaotic bibliography of his many gaffes, while Obama's response will be the concise, elegant final word on the matter, ensuring that Trump's challenge to his intelligence is the very thing that highlights his own intellectual deficiencies for all time. The ultimate, karmic irony is that Trump's attempt to delegitimize his predecessor's mind only served to immortalize his own limitations. And so, we arrive at the checkmate. The intellectual contest, initiated by the challenger's deep insecurity, has concluded with the former professor delivering the final, devastating move. The public humiliation of Donald Trump, achieved not through yelling or tweeting, but through the calm, graceful deployment of superior wit, stands as the final, unassailable verdict on the intellectual capabilities of the two men. This was not a tie, it was an annihilation. Let's revisit the anatomy of that final rhetorical blow, because its perfect construction guarantees its historical endurance. Obama's response: I try not to punch down. Besides, I'm too busy reading. You remember reading, right? Those things with pages, not pictures, actual words, was a masterwork of layered communication that simultaneously achieved three fatal objectives. First, it established the hierarchy, defining the challenger as beneath notice. Second, it attacked the method of operation, revealing Trump's documented aversion to intellectual rigor and factual complexity. Third, it delivered the blow with dignity, ensuring that Obama retained the moral high ground while inflicting maximum cognitive damage. He used the truth, a commodity Trump often treats as negotiable, as his ultimate weapon. The political significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Trump's entire political persona is built upon the fragile foundation of being the winner, the best, the stable genius. This exchange, however, forced the world to acknowledge a verifiable reality, when measured against a man whose mind is trained in constitutional law, critical synthesis, and philosophical discourse. Trump is profoundly, demonstrably outmatched. The image of the highly credentialed scholar calmly explaining the concept of actual words to the former president will forever be the defining symbol of the intellectual chasm between the two. The ultimate irony is that the man who spent a decade questioning Obama's birth certificate and academic legitimacy had his own intellectual credentials publicly incinerated by a single casual aside. The fallout continues to highlight the difference in temperament. Trump's predictable, all-caps meltdown on his social platform, demanding IQ tests, alleging conspiracy, and reviving debunked claims about Obama's college transcripts, only served to confirm the initial diagnosis. Secure, intelligent people do not need to constantly advertise their intellectual prowess or demand verification of their own genius. Their work speaks for them. Insecure people, terrified of exposure, must shout their perceived brilliance louder than the facts. Trump's frantic defense was the ultimate act of projection and confirmation bias, proving that he understood the severity of the damage inflicted. He could survive accusations of policy failure or ethical breaches, But being called not smart by his predecessor was an unforgivable offense that struck at the core of his fragile self-image. Furthermore, this final act of the drama serves as a crucial warning to the electorate. When the stakes are global, when the policy challenges involve climate change, complex international trade, and nuclear stability, the choice between the disciplined, curious mind and the impulsive, incurious ego is not merely a matter of political preference, it is a matter of national and global security. The contrast between Obama, who governed by consulting a vast network of subject matter experts, and Trump, who consistently claimed to know more than the generals, the scientists, and the economists, presents a stark choice. Obama, the man who understood the difference between a picture book and a legal treatise, represented competence grounded in intellectual humility. Trump, the man who thought he could buy Greenland and clean coal with soap, represents chaos born of arrogant ignorance. Historians and political communicators will study this exchange for decades to come. They will analyze Obama's control, his timing, and his ability to leverage his own biography as a rhetorical tool. They will use the episode as a cautionary tale, a clear, undeniable demonstration of what happens when a political figure mistakes volume for intellect and celebrity for competence. The genius of Obama's final verbal maneuver is that it requires no further explanation or defense. It stands on its own, a monument to the power of precision over pretense. The man who challenged the intellectual heavyweight was not merely knocked out, he was vaporized from the debate, leaving nothing behind but the smoke of his own collapsed ego. The final verdict, delivered not by a court or a committee, but by the public reaction, is unanimous. Obama's response was a masterclass. It was witty, fact-based, and devastatingly concise. Trump threw a clumsy, wild swing, and Obama, with a simple, elegant counter-movement, ended the fight while barely moving his feet. This is the difference between the street brawler and the seasoned martial artist, between the simple shout and the surgical strike. And on that note, we conclude this dissection of the political absurdity. The challenge was issued, the answer was delivered, and the historical record has been decisively sealed. The question for the voters in the crucial states remains. As always, do you choose the chaos of the perpetually insecure ego? Or the sober, if sometimes inconvenient, competence of the truly educated mind? The stakes have never been clearer. And the final demonstration of the two men's core capacity, one to communicate with eloquence and intellectual depth, the other to communicate only in self-praise and ill-informed slogans, provides all the necessary information for that vital choice. Checkmate, Donald, checkmate. The game of intellect was over before you even moved your queen.